Kristen Atchison here, and we're talking about the biology of the mind. This is chapter 2 from your textbook, and we're going to be talking about all things brain related today. So I really like this infographic here. It's your brain by the numbers, and it just gives some really interesting breakdowns in terms of how many neurons, how fast these things operate, comparing it to other species of animals. And those sorts of things. So, take a minute, pause it, look over those things. It's very, very interesting. I am a self-described brain nerd, so I apologize if you do not agree. So the nervous system. At the cellular level, we're going to talk about this in several different pieces. We're going to talk about it at the cellular level. We're going to talk about the development of the nervous system. And we're going to talk about the central and peripheral nervous systems as well. And we're going to cover most of this content online, as well as through activities, through Launchpad, and in your textbook. Then in class, we're really going to focus on really the brain, the structure and the functions of that. We'll get into some structure today, but we'll really save most of that for class. And then finally wrapping up with brain imaging techniques. These brain imaging techniques are really one of our kind of newer tools in psychology that we really can use to link the mind and behavior. So, as required, I feel, for every psychology class, we have to learn about the cells of the nervous system. I joke that one of the things that I got really good at drawing as a psych major in college was neurons, because every single class I went to, they drew a neuron on the board, and we got to draw the neuron. So this is kind of, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, a little bit of a rite of passage. So it's made up of several different kinds of cells, one of which is the glial cell. And as you see, these glial cells kind of connect other neurons. They kind of wrap themselves around neurons. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail later. And the ones that you're most familiar with, the type of cell that you're most familiar with in the nervous system is the neuron itself. The structure of the neuron, there's lots of different pieces of this. And this is really important because we'll talk about how these neurons talk to within themselves and talk to each other. And so these structure pieces are very, very important for that. Again, there's some kind of concept activities on Launchpad that will kind of help you see a little bit more graphically how these work. But here's our basic neuron. The dendrites are the little areas at the top. So we have that kind of big cell body, or the soma. And the dendrites are the little branches off of those, okay? So the soma is that big kind of cell body at the top of that image. And the dendrites are the little kind of fingers, the little branches off of that. That's where the information comes in. That's the input center, is the dendrite. And this is where that information is, again, being received from other neurons. So another neuron has something to say. This is where that information comes in to this new neuron. Again, the soma and the cell body is that kind of mass there. And we'll talk about that because that's where the decision is made. Is this a conversation we want to keep having? Do we keep talking about this thing? Are we going to communicate with another neuron? Or is it going to go away? And that's what we'll talk about as an all or none principle. So there's either enough information to fire or there's not enough information. So it's either it fires all the way or it doesn't fire at all. There's no in between. And that decision is happening in that cell body. If the decision is made to fire, the decision is made to communicate with another neuron, that is carried away from the cell body by that axon. That axon's that long piece there. And those axons vary in length depending on where that neuron's connected to. So you saw on that infographic, giraffes have some very, very long axons because they have very, very long bodies. We have some very long axons as well, where the cell body may be one place, but it's communicating with a neuron someplace else in the body. And so it will have a very long axon to carry this information away from it. It's being covered by myelin sheath. This myelin sheath is made up of those glial cells, and it's done to it really helps speed up the processing is one of the things that it does. It's a kind of an insulation. So kind of think of it as, wrapping a pipe or something like that to kind of keep it from freezing. you can kind of think of it maybe similar. Maybe I'm just cold right now, so that seems like a good example for me. But again, it's a cell that's being wrapped around that axon, and what we find is that this myelin sheath really speeds up processing. We'll see that some disorders, neurological disorders, are really, there's a problem with the myelin sheath. We have a degeneration of that. So again, they're covered with this myelin, this fatty insulating substance, and it covers these axons. What again it's really doing is that's really speeding up that information. At the very end of the neuron, at the end of the axon, we have the terminal buttons. So this is where we send the information. They're kind of, these little buttons will be connected across a synapse to a dendrite. So button space, which is a fancy name for our space, is a synapse. So we'll talk about that in more detail. And then it's connected to a new dendrite on a new cell. So again, this is where that kind of that information is released from these terminal buttons. And again, that synapse is that space between those neurons, okay? So everything that you do, everything that you think, everything that's happening is all this is happening every single time, and it's happening on a really massive scale. We're not talking about one neuron is responsible for one thing. A whole series and groups of neurons are responsible for behaviors and activities and these different sorts of things, thoughts. And so again, this really is a very, very integral part of what's happening. When we get to the end of the textbook, when we get to chapter 15 with psychological disorders, we'll see that a lot of psychological disorders are really happening at this neuronal level. They're really happening at the neuron level. We either have neurons not releasing the communications they need to, the neurotransmitters that they need to, or not taking the neurotransmitters up that they're supposed to. We see that depression and anxiety and all these sorts of things are really related to how these neurons are communicating with each other. So we see that the neuron is a very, very important part of this system. And so it really is a good base for you to understand the pieces of it, and we'll talk about some of those, but really do those concept practices that are assigned. There are also additional concept practices that you can look at Launchpad as well, and that you can really see what other kinds of activities these things are doing. So we have several kinds of neurons. We have sensory neurons. So here you see the red line in this graphic is a sensory neuron. And that's where you're sensing something. You're feeling something, you're tasting something, you're seeing something, these sorts of things. You have an inner neuron. An inner neuron is a neuron that's communicating between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. And the motor neurons is the one that makes you move, right? So you touch something hot, that information is carried up into the cell body. A decision is made, oh my gosh, that's hot. We need to tell the rest of the body that that's hot. And the neuron fires. That information travels down the axon to the terminal buttons, across the synapse to another neuron. That information goes into an inner neuron. And again, that's that kind of go-between. The inner neuron has to decide, okay, what do I do with this information? Is it bad enough that we need to move? Well, then yes, I'll fire. And again, that information goes, the fire happens in the cell body, goes down the axon, through the terminal buttons, across the synapse to the dendrites of the motor neuron. And then the motor neuron makes that information, oh, should I move? And it decides, yes, it should move. It fires as well. And so that information happens, and we have the contraction of the muscles that would pull the hand away. So there's multiple different kinds of neurons in the body. We have a lot of different parts of our body that have different proportions of neurons. So this is what's called a homunculus. And this is actually a picture that I took at the Fern Bank this summer. So if you guys are familiar with the Fern Bank, it's one of the natural history or science museums here in the Atlanta area, and it really, really is excellent. And I really nerded out this summer because they had a whole thing on the brain. And in fact, there's several images that I have that I got there because they were so great. But this is a sensory homunculus, and it represents the number of sensory neurons that you have for a particular part of your body. And hopefully we'll do kind of an example with this to kind of show you that when we get to the kind of the perception chapter. We'll do a kind of a perception touch thing that'll be different, and it will feel different whether you do it on your hands, which you see here is very, very large, or whether you do it on your arm. So the parts of the body here that are represented as larger, it's because they has more sensory neurons. So you see that the hands are very, very large. The fingers are very, very large. The lips are very, very large. If this was anatomically correct, the genitalia would be very, very large because there are a lot more sensory neurons there that are feeling these sorts of things. The nose is large, the eyes is large, are large, as compared to the shoulders, which are pretty normal size. So again, these homunculus really kind of give us a kind of a graphical representation of kind of how these neurons are denser in some areas than they are in other areas. This is a sensory homunculus. There's also, you could look it up on, you could Google it. There's a motor homunculus, which would have similar kinds of distortions to show you, again, where there's more motor neurons and where there's less. And think about it. Where can you make more fine-grained kind of movement? It's going to be similar in your mouth, in your hands. I mean, think about all the different ways that you have to move your lips and your tongue and your throat to say a word. And so that's requiring a lot of motor coordination that you don't necessarily need, in your ankles. So again, we'll see that there are different proportions of these neurons across the body. So on to the really kind of important part, especially for psychology, is the communication. So here's that, what I was talking about, kind of that all or none kind of situation. So we have this, how neurons talk within the neuron is this, it's all electrochemical transmission, okay? So information comes into it. Once we have that information inside the neuron, this is kind of what's happening. The neuron starts in this resting potential kind of place. And if you look at this graph, it's happening very, very fast. This graph is done in 3 milliseconds, so we're talking about very, very fast that these kinds of transmissions are happening. So the neuron starts in resting potential. It's just hanging out. It's just chilling. There's a change in the neuron's charge. So information has come in. We have new neurotransmitters that change this information. And the question is do we hit this threshold of excitation, which is really, really fancy enough word to say, are we excited enough to is this important enough to share? Do we need to tell another neuron about this? And so again, this is all happening inside the cell body itself, this threshold of excitation. And if we get high enough, if we hit this threshold, we have action potential. And again, this is all or none. So we either have enough to fire or we don't. You don't get a neuron half firing. A neuron either fires or it doesn't. It's not going to have a kind of a 3/4 fire or a quarter fire. It either fires or it doesn't. So either has enough information to fire or it doesn't fire at all. And so again, this is going to be, this all or none principle is very, very important because that information can stop within one neuron. One neuron can kind of shut it down in certain situations because of this all or none principle. It either fires because it has enough information to fire, or it doesn't fire because it doesn't have. Did we hit that threshold? If we hit that threshold, then we can fire. If we didn't hit that threshold, we won't fire. That action potential won't be reached. So again, the last piece of that is the neuron really fires. That happens kind of up here at this peak. And then we have this refractory potential where it's kind of going down. And you see it will dip actually below resting potential, and then the neuron will be back kind of at its stable level. Okay, so this is all happening within the neuron. Okay, and that's different than this next slide, which is happening what's talking between the neurons. Okay. So one neuron is going to release a neurotransmitter. And again, these are those electrochemical kinds of information that's happening. And there's a ton of different kinds of neurotransmitters. And we aren't going to go into those in detail in this lecture or in either of our lectures, but it is important information, and we'll talk about them throughout this semester. So really go through that in your book. Your book does a pretty good job of talking about what they are, what they do, kind of how we know what they do, and these sorts of things. And again, especially when we get to chapter 15, psychological disorders, we'll see that those are very, very important. But they're important all along the way. So, neuron A, the presynaptic neuron, the neuron before the synapse. Remember, the synapse is just that fancy word for that gap between the two neurons, okay? They're not actually touching. There's a little gap between them, and the synapse is just that fancy word for this connection or this gap between these two neurons. So, we have this presynaptic neuron releases its information, it releases its neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter crosses the synapse. So that information goes across the synapse, and it stimulates the receptors in the postsynaptic neuron. Again, we're just being fancy here with words. That's the neuron, the second neuron, neuron B, the neuron on the other side of the synapse, on the other side of it. Again, if that threshold of excitation is reached, we'll have that neuron fired. If that threshold of excitation is not reached, it won't fire. We won't have action potential. Remember, it's all or none. So again, really, that decision is happening in the postsynaptic cell. It's happening in the postsynaptic cell body, whether they're making the decision to fire again or not. So here's kind of what that synapse looks like. So we have that presynaptic terminal. Again, this is happening with those terminal buds. We have these synaptic vesicles, which are really just like, kind of think of them like a little bubble that's carrying the neurotransmitter, that's carrying the information that we're about to share with the postsynaptic neuron. Again, that information is coming in at the postsynaptic neuron at the dendrite. It's coming in at those little fingers that are coming off of that cell body. And they're going into receptor sites. And that space between those is that synaptic gap. So the synapse itself is the connection between two neurons, and the space between them is really the synaptic gap. And so the neurotransmitters go across, and if the right neurotransmitters are released, then there's the right receptor, it'll kind of plug in. So it's kind of like a lock and key system. There's only certain receptors on certain neurons, and so if the right information is not released, nothing will go in. So it really is kind of making sure you have the right key for the right lock. So neurons actually can do a lot of learning on their own, okay? So this is, again, one of the things I got at the Fernbank, and I really just like it. It talks about how neurons can strengthen these synaptic connections, okay? And so the first time, the picture at the top, it says there's really weak connection, okay? So the first time that this really happens, the neuron fires the neurotransmitters, and the receptors receive the signal, but it was kind of like, yeah, we got this one receptor for it, but sure, whatever. If this happens again and again, if we keep having this connection being important, if something good happened out of that or something important happened out of that, then these neural connections will actually get stronger. And what we see is that more receptors will actually grow on that postsynaptic neuron, on that second neuron. They'll get more locks for these keys that are being released, okay? So instead of having, one lock for these 15 keys that have to get across, we'll start to get more and more locks for these keys. And as this really goes on and on after many repetitions, this becomes a really, really strong connection. More neurotransmitters are released and more receptors make a stronger signal. So we're more likely to have the firing of that postsynaptic because we've hit that action potential, okay? So again, it makes it easier for these neurons to communicate. It strengthens them and makes the connections stronger and easier to process these things, okay? And so when we talk about development, in a minute here, the development of the nervous system, we'll see that this is happening kind of all along, that these synapses are connecting and they're growing and they're being strengthened. If they're not being strengthened, if this connection stays really, really weak, you'll probably lose that connection because it's not really important. And we'll talk about that in a second.
As the brain develops, the majority of axons become myelinated. In this process, nearby glial cells literally reach out and wrap axons with adjacent segments of a fatty substance that functions as a sort of insulator for the axon membrane. Myelin disrupts the movement of the action potential along the cell membrane. This disruption forces the electrical signal to jump through the axon beneath the surface areas that are insulated by myelin. The electrical charge jumps to the next region on the axon that is not insulated by myelin. These regions are known as nodes of Ranvier. At each node, the electrical impulse can be recharged by a strong flow of electrically charged particles entering through the membrane. The strengthening electrical impulse then jumps to the next node, where the process is repeated. Transmission of an electrical impulse is much more rapid, up to 10 times faster, in myelinated axons than in unmyelinated axons.
So that's a video from your textbook. I'm sorry for the automatic start. I forgot it was going to do that. So again, these glial cells really are reaching out and wrapping around the neuron. The myelin, again, remember we talked about myelin was one of those things that it's that insulating substance that speeds up the transmission down the axon. Again, it's composed of glial cells, and it really makes this more efficient and kind of a stronger transmission. Okay, so these glial cells are very, very important. And again, we talk about how when we have either a cell that isn't well insulated, that doesn't have a lot of myelin sheath on it, it's not going to function as well. And so we won't see that neuron really be as important. And we also see that if it is an important neuron, some disorders involve the demyelination of these things. And that's really what is behind some of these neurological disorders that are causing the problems in function and processing and these sorts of things. So there's a link for this YouTube video on D2L. I encourage you to watch it. It's pretty short. It's a minute and a half, but it really does help kind of give you an idea of how this development of the brain really plays out, okay? And how kind of a complex system that it really is. And this is happening prenatal. So this is happening before we're even born. So this system is really starting very, very, very early and is an ongoing process. So here kind of shows you the span of brain development. So on the left, we have prenatal period in months. So these are, basically conception, essentially. A couple of months after conception, once we have kind of the heart and all of that going, then the brain really starts going. So we're just a couple months after conception that we really start getting this brain development. We really start getting this neural development. And what we see is that at the beginning, what we're happening is that they're making neurons, okay? So the brain is making, or not the brain, the body is making neurons that's making these kinds of cells, and migration of these neurons. So these neurons are moving and going to the places that they're supposed to be in the organism. And this is happening very, very early on. Then the kind of next thing that really starts to happen is myelination, okay? And that's, again, happening through a large part of the lifespan. If you really look at this graph here, you see that that we have brain development going on really into our teens, and even newer research is suggesting that it goes on into our early 20s and sometimes into our mid-20s, okay? When I first learned about this kind of brain development, I was actually already in graduate school because, again, this is newer information that we're continuing to learn and change. And I was like, oh, well, that now makes so much sense to me. I feel like I look back at some of the decisions I made in college and in high school, and I go, what was I thinking? What made me think that was a good idea? Well, whether it's anecdotal or not, maybe I can just blame it on my brain development. My brain wasn't done processing. My brain wasn't done developing. And so we see that this is really an ongoing process. And even past early 20s and mid 20s into adulthood, we still see changes in the brain, and not just losses. We really see increases in connections and strengthening. It's just a different kind of development than we saw earlier on. Early on, it really is just kind of getting this instrument up and running, and getting it really up and running as a fine-tuned instrument really is, again, taking it to our early to mid 20s. So the green line is where we see audio and visual areas of the brain developing. So we see that happening really early on, especially the auditory stuff. We see a pretty adult-like auditory understanding and our sensory abilities at birth. In fact, fetuses can hear in utero, and they can actually learn things through auditory information in utero. We'll see language kind of taking over next with that blue line, the language areas of the cerebral cortex kind of being the next big area of development. And then we see the last one is that frontal lobes of the cerebral cortex. And this is, again, where I said, oh, well, maybe that's why I was making such bad decisions. Because that frontal area of our frontal lobes, and again, that's the front, right? So it's really the front of our brain. So if you put your hand on your forehead, you're putting your hand on your frontal lobes. That's the decision-making part of our brain, okay? That's where we have all these kinds of executive function things, making decisions, switching between activities. Really, these higher order human processes are happening in the front of the brain. If you think about the brain development in terms of evolution, the brain is kind of built, and I'll show you this in class with a puzzle that I have for my daughter, but it's built from the bottom to the back. So put your hands on the back of your neck, kind of right where it meets your skull. And that's where the brain development evolutionary really started. So your brainstem is the oldest part of your brain. And as you kind of move your hands up your scalp and move your heads further forward, that's what came next, okay? So the frontal cortex is the newest evolutionary part of our brain, which is why other animals who have frontal cortexes are so much less developed than ours, okay? Ours is, again, newer. You'll see that other primates will have bigger frontal cortexes than, say, other kinds of mammals. So again, this is kind of the most evolutionary advanced part of our brain, is the forward, where if you look at the brainstem, lots of really lesser organisms really have similar structures as our brainstem. So nervous system development at the cellular level, again, we start out making neurons, and that's called proliferation, okay? So we're making neurons, and this is really happening. Most of them are really happening very, very early, between 10 and 26 weeks, okay? So this is happening before viability, okay? This is happening very, very early. This is happening before the end of the first trimester, is when this is starting, okay? So this is happening very, very early on in development. We see that they're being made at about the rate of 250,000 per minute. I mean, think about that. That is unbelievable. 250,000 neurons per minute is being made between 10 and 26 weeks prenatal. The next job is to really move those neurons to where they're supposed to go. And we're talking about a lot of neurons here, right? And a lot of neurons are having to get to these certain parts of the brain and the certain parts of the body and certain parts of the nervous system. And this is pretty much done by 7 months prenatal, okay? So they still, the fetus still has about 2 months to go, and the brain structure-wise is kind of done, right? It's got the cells it really needs. It's got the cells where they're supposed to be. What it doesn't really have is what we do in elaboration or differentiation. This is where the brain is really growing in size. The neurons are really growing. The synapses are happening. And we're getting these cells myelinated, okay? So everything's there, but it's kind of a skeleton system up until 7 months, okay? And once we hit that kind of, if you look at kind of fetal growth, one of the things that we see growing a lot in that last couple of months is brain development. one of the biggest things that we see problems with in premature babies is problems related to brain development, because that's really one of the last things that's happening. The brain finishing off the lungs and weight gain are those things that are happening in those last couple of months. And so babies that are really born very, very early, those are the kinds of things that they most have to deal with. So again, we see a lot of growth in size happening then, myelination, where we're wrapping those axon and glial cells to really speed up that processing. And synaptogenesis, which is just a really fancy word of saying making new synapses, okay? So genesis is kind of creation, synapto is the synapse. So that word is big and fancy for no reason. It really is just making new synapses, okay? And again, this is going to be a really, really important part, because if you have, it doesn't matter how many neurons you have, if they're not talking to other neurons, it doesn't do you any good. So really this communication, this ability to communicate between neurons and making these communications really, really strong is what we're going to see is very, very important. So important that we have a whole slide dedicated to it. Again, this is that creation of those neuronal connections. That's the creation of neuron A is now talking to neuron B. Okay. And again, this is really, really immature early on, okay? So we see some connections, we see some synapses being formed around 4 months gestation, so 4 months pregnant. And we see some of these neurons actually becoming mature by 8 months. And we're not talking about 8 months of age. We still have some mature neurons really, really early on. This synaptogenesis is very, very rapid in the first 2 years of life. And the first 2 years of life are considered infancy, so 2 and below. So when you're saying, oh, your kid's 24 months, that's really technically okay. You're not saying your kid's 2, because we really are still in that infant phase. And so it's really, really rapid in the first 2 years of life. And if you think about the difference between a newborn infant and a 2-year-old, they're kind of night and day. And a lot of that has to do with these synapse formations, okay? This change in synaptogenesis is really causing these big leaps and bounds that we see in the infant. This also peaks in different brain regions at different times. Okay, so when we saw that slide just a minute ago, we saw kind of the peaks in audio and visual first, then we saw the peak in the language systems, and then we saw the peak in the frontal cortex. Again, we're seeing peaks at different times because this is really happening kind of throughout development, throughout life. But we're seeing the bulk of it really happening very, very early. The way this works is the brain starts by overproducing, okay? We're just going to make as many connections as we can make, and we'll see which ones are good ones, okay? So what they do is it really just makes more than you need, okay? And then it starts to get rid of the ones that aren't very good, okay? So, and this again is varying by area, how this works. We see this is happening again around 6 years for the visual cortex, around 15 years and up to, again, could be 25 years for that prefrontal cortex. So we're seeing those differences. So again, you can see that here in this graph, same graph I just showed you. We see that peak in the synapses for audio and visual early, and then we see those synapses go down. So we start with this overproduction of synapses, and then we start to prune those. That's what it's called. It's called synaptic pruning. So just if you have any kind of gardening experience, when you go and you cut your plants to make them healthier, you're pruning. And that's what the brain does. The brain prunes these synapses and keeps the healthy ones and gets rid of the unhealthy ones so that the healthy ones can grow stronger. And that's what's happening. And so when you see the green line go down, we have synaptic pruning in the audio and visual cortex. When we see the blue line go down in this graph, you see synaptic pruning happening in the language areas of the cerebral cortex. And when we look at the purple line, we're seeing that happening in the frontal lobes of the cerebral cortex. Okay, so that's kind of takes us through the cellular level of the brain. It takes us through brain development, and we're going to kind of finish up with some of this kind of nervous system stuff. Again, you've got a video that you'll watch on this as well. So I'm going to kind of cover it glossary because there are other resources that are really giving you this information that you will need for exams and the like. So the nervous system is really broken into two pieces. The peripheral nervous system, which is kind of your whole body, so your fingers and your toes and your arms and your lungs and all of that. So our sensory and our motor neurons are really happening on this peripheral nervous system primarily. Our central nervous system, on the other hand, is kind of the green, and that's where we have our brain and our spinal cord, okay? So our spinal cord is part of that, and our brain is clearly part of that, and those are really those kind of overlying organizational systems that direct this peripheral nervous system. But of course, both are very, very important. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, whereas the peripheral nervous system includes the somatic nervous system, which is a voluntary system. So when you decide to move your arm, that's part of the somatic nervous system, okay? The autonomic nervous system is the involuntary system, okay? So that's your heart beating, that's your lungs breathing, that's, reflexes. Things like that are happening on this autonomic nervous system in the peripheral nervous system. I'm sorry, I thought that was up there. And there's two pieces of this autonomic nervous system. We have the parasympathetic, which is the calming side, okay? And we have the sympathetic, which is the activating side. Again, there's some really great video that you should watch that really, really help direct you through these kind of nuances on this. But these are areas that you really do need to know the differences on, the differences between parasympathetic and sympathetic as part of an autonomic nervous system. And how this kind of lineage works, okay? So again, this is information that you do need. I, again, refer to the text and some of the other online activities to really kind of further get this information. You just don't have to listen to me lecture in this video forever. Okay, so the anatomy of the brain. Like I said, the brainstem, the oldest part of the brain, okay? So this kind of blue part that we have here on this image, along with this kind of orange part, but primarily the blue part is kind of our oldest part, okay? So that includes the medulla. The medulla, if you can see, is kind of the first lump, if you're going from the brainstem from the bottom up, that's that first lump on the brainstem. This is, again, going to control heartbeat and breathing and these sorts of things. And you can see why this is an older evolutionary system. Every animal breathes. Every animal has a heartbeat. And so, again, this is really an older part of the central nervous system. The pons, that is going to be our second bump going up the brainstem, and this is really helping us regulate sleep and respiration, swallowing, bladder function, hearing, equilibrium, so kind of balancey kinds of things a little bit, taste, eye movement, facial expressions, facial sensation, and posture. Again, these are all important things no matter where you are in the animal kingdom. So these are parts of the brain that are a lot older in this hindbrain, in this brainstem, that really have a lot of evolutionary clout to them. The reticular formation is kind of like rod shaped at the top of the brainstem. And again, it's helping with sleep and wakefulness and levels of arousal. And the cerebellum is kind of looks like a little mini brain at the back. And this is really helpful for nonverbal learning. And it helps coordinate voluntary movements. We see that when we see increases in cerebellum development early on, this is really correlated and directly related to increases that we see in motor development in infants. So this is really kind of important in a lot of movement. Again, if you're an animal, it's important to move. So again, this is something that really is evolutionarily a lot older. The limbic system is our next oldest part. Okay, so brainstem's oldest evolutionary, limbic system's next. And this includes the hippocampus, which is kind of this wishbone-shaped structure. And this is really helpful with memories, okay? And so we'll talk about, when we get to the memory chapter, we'll talk about hippocampal function and how this really is affecting that. The hypothalamus is that kind of peanut-shaped orange guy there in the middle. And this really is related to the endocrine system. And the brain. So it really creates the link between those. It regulates our eating and our drinking, our sexual activity, and our sleep. Clearly, all of those important. Some of us have more value on one than the other. But all of those things are happening in the hypothalamus. The amygdala is this almond-shaped structure. It's green, and we see that this is very highly related to emotion, especially things like anger and memory. So we'll see when sometimes when we talk about memory, highly emotionally charged memories are easier to remember. Okay, so think about an event that was like really, really traumatic for you. You can remember fine details about that you might not necessarily be able to remember about something else. The amygdala is playing a role in that. It's connecting that emotion and that memory and saying, hey, this is important. Both of these things are happening. And the amygdala is really helping the brain kind of make that connection between emotion and memory and saying, oh, this is something I need to remember because this is very, very important. And finally, the thalamus is kind of the red structure here in this image. And it really is kind of an integration information system for a lot of our senses. So it does all of them except smell. And that's, again, smell is kind of, in some ways, a different evolved system. And so that's why it's kind of not in the thalamus. But it relays information, okay? So it's kind of an input center from the sensory systems, and then can kind of go out to the rest of the brain to deal with it, what we need to do with this new information we got from the sensory systems. And then the newest part of the brain, our big, shining evolutionary advantage is the cortex, okay? The cortex is this kind of outlying, so you can see a little bit of the brainstem, you can see a little bit of the cerebellum at the bottom, but you can't see any of that midbrain structure because the cortex covers it all. Okay, so the cortex, all the kind of groovy gray matter that you think of in the brain is actually your cortex. And again, this is the newest part of the brain evolutionary. It's still evolved kind of that back to front kind of thing, where we'll see the occipital lobe is going to have kind of a larger evolutionary history than the frontal lobe, where we're seeing different kinds of behaviors. So the occipital lobe, if you put your hands on the back of your head, the back of your skull, that's your occipital lobe. So if you ever hit your head, the back of your head, and you see stars, that's because you hit your occipital lobe against your skull. Your occipital lobe is where you have vision processing is happening in that occipital lobe. Okay, so when your eyes are connected straight to the back of your head, they cross, but they are connected straight to the back of your head, and they're connected to that occipital lobe. So that's really where our primary visual cortex is in that occipital lobe, and it processes all our visual information. We'll even say that there's a part of the brain back there that's called the fusiform face area, that its only job is to recognize faces. So again, all that kind of visual input information is happening in that occipital lobe. And so again, when people hit their head and they see stars or their vision's blurry in the back, that's because that occipital lobe hit the back of their skull. The next one is the yellow. That's going to be our temporal lobe. If you put your hands on your ears, that's your temporal lobe. It's really helpful. Your ears are directly connected to your temporal lobe, so your temporal lobe is doing all that auditory stuff, right? So it makes it easy to remember. The temporal lobe is doing your auditory because they're right next to your ears. If your hands are on your ears, you're kind of covering your temporal lobes. So again, this is doing all that auditory information. This is where things like cochlear implants and those sorts of things are going to be connected into to really aid in this processing. We have a parietal lobe is kind of connected to both the occipital and the temporal lobe, and that's that blue image. And in that parietal lobe, we have our somatosensory cortex, which is receiving all our body sensation information is happening there. Okay, so all those kind of sensory neurons are coming into this somatosensory cortex, which is part of the parietal lobe. There's other stuff going on there as well, but that's one of the things that's happening. Right in front of that somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe, we have the primary motor cortex. And so this controls all our voluntary motor movement, and that's actually happening in the frontal lobe. As the frontal lobe goes further forward, again, that's where we're having a lot of that executive function. Those making decisions, switching tasks, all those kinds of attention, all happening in that frontal lobe. So again, occipital, in this picture it's the blue, is doing that visual information. Parietal has that information about the touch through the somatosensory cortex. Temporal, which is the red here, is doing hearing. There's also some language happening there as well in the form of Wernicke's area, which we'll talk about later. And the frontal lobe, the purple, is again where kind of the big show is. This has all of our executive functioning, including planning, judgment, memory, reasoning, abstract thinking, language production, and movement. We also have the motor cortex in here. If you kind of look at this brain picture, you see in the parietal lobe kind of one straight strip where it touches the frontal lobe, where there's one straight strip. The straight strips there in the yellow in the parietal lobe are that somatosensory cortex, and in the purple is that motor cortex. So again, they're right next to each other, with the idea that those inner neurons are connecting that information between them, like we talked about earlier. There's two areas of the brain that we know a lot of language is happening, and we'll talk about these a little bit more when we get to our language chapter. But Broca's area is the green area here, and this is actually where we're producing words, okay? This isn't understanding words, this is producing words. Where Wernicke's area, the part that's in the temporal lobe, is actually where we have the comprehension happening, okay? So we need multiple parts of the brain. So if somebody has a damage to Broca's area, they're going to have problems speaking words. They're going to understand what people are saying because Wernicke's area is okay, but they're going to have problems creating words, producing words. Whereas someone has a damage to Wernicke's area, they can say as many words as they want, but it's not going to make any sense, and they're not going to understand other people because there's no syntax to string those words together in a sensical way, and there's no comprehension of understanding what other people are saying. So clearly both of these areas are very, very important, and we'll talk about these more when we get to the chapter on language. The cortex is, again, that top piece of the brain where this is kind of all happening, and it's broken into two hemispheres. We have the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and those are really easy to figure out which one's which. One's your left and one's your right. Easy as long as you know your left and your right. My husband will joke that I still do not know my left and my right. So again, as long as you know your left and right, you should be okay with which hemisphere. And these are actually connected with this thing that's called the corpus callosum, and you can see it here in this image here, and it really is where these two hemispheres are connected. If you look in this slide, you can see that there's very little connection really between these hemispheres. We have a lot of still folds happening, and we have the corpus callosum, which is that area just above those kind of two gaps in the brain, those ventricles in the brain. Is where we have this connection really happening. But we see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe in both the left and the right hemisphere. And different parts of the hemispheres will do different things. We will have what we call hemispheric specialization, where different hemispheres do different things. But that's a topic for another day. We'll talk about those kinds of pieces of the brain and what they do in our next class. So this kind of sums up the cellular level of the nervous system, development of the brain, and really the structures of the brain. Kind of the meat that we're going to cover is going to be about function from here on out. So we're going to talk about function of the brain, and we're also going to talk about how we can see the brain, and how we can see brain activity, all these kind of brain imaging techniques that we really use in psychology to kind of answer these questions about the mind and the body. It'll be helpful for you to bring your textbook or access to your textbook to class on Tuesday because we will be kind of using these charts that are in the textbook about what areas of the brain do what for an in-class activity. See you on Tuesday.